Welcome everyone to the M-Cubed weekly seminar. Today our speaker is Robert Prestley. Robert is an Associate Scientist 3 in M-Cube's Prediction, Assimilation, and Risk Communication section. Robert has a master's degree in communication from the University of Kentucky and a BS in meteorology from Penn State. His research explores the roles of authoritative sources of weather information, such as the National Weather Service, broadcast meteorologists, and emergency managers in the information and communication system during weather disasters. It particularly focuses on how authoritative sources use imagery, especially on social media networks, to engage at-risk members of the public and promote protective action taking when hazardous weather strikes. So appropriately, the title is on this very topic, and it's called Tweeting Through the Storm, and using social media data to understand the dissemination and retransmission of tropical cyclone risk information. And I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting presentation. Thank you. Come on in.
All right. The mic working good? Good on that front? Okay, let me just get a timer set up here. All right. Thank you so much for that introduction. And yeah, I think a lot of those topics are going to be things that I'm going to be talking about a little bit in this seminar here today. So I'm excited to get started here and talk about some of this social media data analysis that I've been working on for a few years now. So before I get into sort of our analysis, I really wanted to give those of you who don't maybe know me as well a little bit of a background on my personal and professional history and sort of how I got to this point. And so I'm going to go way back to my early childhood in the mid-2000s, and I hope that doesn't age any of you here. But I have been one of those weather nerds who has been excited about the weather ever since I was a little kid. I think a huge part of my interest in the weather was stemmed by watching the daily news and seeing the TV meteorologists. And so this is a picture of me with one of the meteorologists at the Milwaukee station where I grew up. And I just adored him and I loved him, and we would watch the news and see him on TV every night. And I was so enamored with broadcast meteorologists that I became my own broadcast meteorologist for my family, and I would print off weather graphics and tape them to the TV and then go through each of them for my family. And so I think, yeah, from an early age, I've always been interested in broadcast meteorologists and that sort of communication of weather information. And so that passion then eventually led me to Penn State, where I got my bachelor's degree in meteorology. And so I really enjoyed a lot of the meteorology coursework I took while I was there, but I also became involved in clubs like the Emergency Management Club and Campus Weather Service. And through those experiences, again, I sort of really came out of it with this deep appreciation for the need to better communicate weather information, to make sure that the meteorology that has improved so much over the past few decades reaches people and leads them to make better protective action decisions. And so I did get the opportunity to do research as an undergrad on social science, which I think was a really exciting experience for me. And so this is research that I did at an undergraduate research experiences program at Texas A&M. And so I was given this survey data set and had no idea what to do with it, but ended up looking at trust in information sources and how that affected people's perceptions and whether they decided to evacuate during Hurricane Ike. And a year later, I got the opportunity, my first sort of experience with social media data as part of the Holland Scholarship Program. And I was at the Weather Service office in Louisville, Kentucky. And so again, with this social media data, being able to look at topics like what was in these tweets, what these Weather Service accounts were tweeting about, and how that changed for different types of events and sort of in the different time periods in and around different types of weather events. And so that then eventually led me to the University of Kentucky, which is where I got my master's degree in communication. And while I was there, I continued to sort of work on this Twitter data analysis, working with Dr. Jeanette Sutton and others there. And again, really looking at this sort of understanding how these sort of professional sources of information, such as the Weather Service, were communicating different types of information and over different timelines, looking at this sort of communication continuum across threat and non-threat periods to understand how different communication strategies were appropriate at different times in the context of disasters. I also completed my master's thesis, and again, kind of brought me back to broadcast meteorologists and looking at how they communicated over the course of Hurricane Harvey through, again, just a a really interesting sort of period of time beginning before Hurricane Harvey even made landfall and ending when this station's studio actually flooded and they had to evacuate. And so we were able to see with this sort of rich qualitative data the ways in which different patterns of language were present in the way that these meteorologists spoke and tried to urge people to take different sort of actions as this sort of unprecedented disaster unfolded around them. And so that then brings me to today and my time here at NCAR, and I've been here for about 4 years now, sort of on the dot. I started in August of 2019. And so the work that I'm going to be talking about today with social media data analysis is the bulk of the work that I've done since I've started here. But I've also been involved in other projects, for instance, looking at developing timing guidance for fire weather and winter weather parameters for use by weather service forecasters and other sort of key partners. I've been involved in projects evaluating probabilistic winter weather forecast information, again, among these key weather service partners, including broadcast meteorologists, including emergency managers, other sorts of folks. And more recently, I've been involved in a project evaluating hurricane threats and impacts graphics, again, among these sort of core sets of weather communicators, including broadcasters and emergency managers. And so trying to take sort of all of my personal and professional and research experience and sort of condense it into a few key theoretical and practical areas of interest, you kind of come up with these sort of topics that were mentioned in my introduction, thinking about how risk information and communication across weather disasters varies and evolves as these disasters evolve, as the meteorological details of a disaster evolve, and especially in the context of tropical cyclones. Thinking about how we can improve risk visualization to visualize different aspects of different hazards, of different sorts of disasters. And thinking about how we can use social media as a data analysis tool to answer questions about risk information and about risk visualization. And so these are some of the things that I've worked on in my time as a researcher, and they really sort of serve as the grounding principles behind the work that I'm going to be talking about today. And so later on, I will be presenting some of our key findings in relation to some of these key topics. So before I get into sort of our data analysis, I wanted to just provide a little bit more detail on each of these topics and some of the theoretical and practical background on each of them. And so starting with thinking about risk information and communication across weather disasters, a common way that this has been characterized is through the development of disaster phase models. And so this is sort of a common example of what one of those might look like. You can think about it as having sort of this 4-phase model is very common in a lot of this literature, and thinking about how before a disaster you may be involved in efforts to mitigate disaster or prepare for a disaster when it appears imminent. The disaster occurs, and then you go immediately into response and recovery. And so these sorts of things then form a cycle, and recovery informs mitigation and so on. And so this can be a very useful heuristic, especially for emergency managers to make decisions about when they should be engaging in different sorts of activities, but it is limited. It does miss the nuance and context. So for instance, there are overlaps and there are in-between periods between these different aspects of this cycle that go a little bit more unexplored. And so we can think about this time between preparation and response, for instance, as a really interesting sort of overlap, especially for meteorological disasters where you may be engaged in preparation activities and be responding to a disaster at the same time. And so this sort of time period, which begins when we have maybe sort of a signal that a disaster may occur in the near to short-term future, up until the time when we begin to see impacts and that response activity begins, is what we call the forecast and warning phase. And so it really represents, again, that transition between preparedness and response. And this time period is really characterized by uncertainty and how information and communication responds to changing uncertainty as a disaster approaches. And so this graphic, again, just shows how the meteorological attributes of a storm inform how people engage with different types of information, engage with each other in different ways, and again, how that evolves over the course of a storm as the meteorological attributes change and as information about the meteorological attributes changes. And so during this time period, when people are making a lot of decisions about what protective actions to take, about whether they should evacuate from a hurricane or board up their house or not do anything at all, professional sources, again, play a really key role in not only making a lot of those decisions in terms of ordering people to evacuate or other sorts of decisions, but also serving as a conduit, as an information source for other folks who are maybe making those decisions for themselves. And so risk visualization plays then a really key role during this forecast and warning phase because it allows these professional sources to compact a lot of dense risk information into usable, understandable visual displays. And so, for instance, when we think about the tropical cyclone context, here are just a smattering of visuals that have been developed or that are continuing to be developed as a way to visualize different aspects of tropical cyclones, whether that be its future forecast track or its current positioning, whether that be the probability of certain things happening or the potential for impacts. And so, again, there are all of these different attributes that are associated with tropical cyclones. There are different hazards associated with it that have very different impacts over different spatial scales. And so these risk visualizations really play a key role in being able to compact a lot of that information and communicate it more efficiently. And so as a response, there have been many efforts to improve some of these existing visuals or to create new tropical cyclone visuals to try to improve this communication so that we ensure that the visuals that we're putting out are things that are going to be usable and understandable to folks and to make sure that they can use them to appropriately make protective action decisions. And so finally, this leads me to some background on social media data analysis. And so I think the first question you have to ask with this is why analyze social media data? Why is it important, and why is it something that's important to study? And so for me, the way that I think about it, I think that social media data really provides sort of a natural laboratory for observing social phenomena during disasters that might be difficult to observe in other ways. The way that we typically try to measure concepts or measure how people are perceiving disasters or making sense of them is through surveys. But often we can only do those surveys after a disaster has occurred or before a disaster has occurred. It's very difficult to get that sort of information during disasters. And so social media data kind of fills in those gaps because it provides temporarily detailed logs of how people are engaging with different types of information and how they're acting on it. And so we can learn a lot from social media data in terms of what it says about disasters generally. We can see a lot of the early studies on social media were just kind of looking at ways different members of the public were gathering and retransmitting information in response to this sort of new way to interrogate different sort of disaster information that was developing. We can also see how public risk perceptions and behaviors shift as disasters evolve by stringing together sort of streams of tweets from different people and seeing, again, you can see how their responses evolve as the storm evolves. And then sort of most interest for the work I'm going to talk about here today, we can see how professional sources are using social media and see sort of the range and the frequency of different expressions that they might use on social media, what types of visuals they're using, what types of text phrases they're using. And that can be really valuable in terms of giving us sort of a backdrop of understanding what sort of information is being prioritized, what information is out there for people to engage with. So I want to talk briefly about two concepts of interest that I'm going to kind of refer to throughout the following analyses that I'm talking about here today. And so the first is dissemination. And so dissemination simply refers to the frequency with which certain types of risk information appear on social media. And so again, this just gives us an idea of what types of information people can have access to on social media, and again, can give us a sense of what maybe is being prioritized by different professional sources. And so we operationalize this simply by looking at the counts of different sort of categories within tweets, or certain types of tweets that we see on social media. The other concept of interest here is retransmission. And so this describes the degree, it's sort of the network effects of Twitter, describing the degree to which information on social media can penetrate different social networks. And so this is often operationalized by retweets or shares, because it, again, shows you the ways in which different information can reach different people. And again, this is really important to understand because the more times that people see pieces of information, the more likely they are to act on it. And of course, we want to reach as many people on as many platforms as possible to get people to have a knowledgeable understanding of a disaster as it begins to approach them. And so obviously, social media data is not infallible. It comes with its own set of biases. We know that the folks who are on social media often are not a representative sample of everybody in a state or a country or a region or whatever. And so that makes it even more important to really carefully consider how that social media data is collected and filtered and analyzed. And so this has been sort of a major contribution of the work that we've done, is kind of developing methodologies for how we can do this more thoughtfully. And so our methodology consists of essentially 4 different aspects. And the first is thinking about how tweets are collected. There are multiple different entry points in terms of how tweets can be collected. And so this includes questions about who to collect tweets from, what types of tweets to include, and over which timeframes. The next step in our methodology is thinking about how to filter tweets. And so there are often a lot of big data approaches to analyze social media data, and those can be valuable depending on the research question. But for the work that we are interested in, I think it's really important to take these very large data sets that you can get on Twitter and really focus them down onto the types of content that are most usable for at-risk users, that are most managed, and that are also much more manageable for us to do the sorts of analyses that we want to do with them. And so it sort of takes big data and filters it down to analyses that we can have much more contextualized analysis of. The next step is thinking about how to code for different risk concepts. And so this can be pulled from the literature or can be based on sort of top-down approaches. But some of the things that we've looked at on Twitter are who is tweeting, so categorizing different professional sources on several different dimensions. We've looked at imagery in tweets, and we've also looked at other types of information content. And so those help us to categorize tweets and to understand what types of information we're seeing in our data sets. And finally, this is more of just sort of a general note, but our methods really build on each other over time. And so, for instance, today I'm going to be talking to you about 2 case studies we've done. The first one that we did was more experimental and more of an exploratory approach, and we made a lot of mistakes. And we learned from those and applied those when we did our second case study. And our data is also informed by initial qualitative work. We think that that's a really important part of the process in terms of making sure that the quantitative results that come out of our analyses are really informed by previous results that we've seen qualitatively. And so in this seminar, I'll be discussing social media data analyses conducted for 2 hurricane cases. So the first here is Hurricane Harvey. The second is for Hurricane Irma. And so these were both devastating 2017 hurricanes, but they had very different sort of meteorological attributes. Harvey was much more low lead time. There were only about 3 days between when it redeveloped in the Gulf of Mexico and when it made landfall on the Texas coast. And after it made landfall, its primary feature was that it sort of just hung around Texas and led to really devastating flooding impacts, especially in the Houston metro area. Irma was more of what we might call a typically evolving tropical cyclone threat, wherein we saw it coming from way out in the Atlantic, maybe about 10 days before it made landfall, and we were able to sort of track where it was going and where its highest impacts might be up until the point when it made landfall in Florida. And parts of Florida saw this whole suite of hazards associated with tropical cyclones. And so being able to look at these 2 different cases allows us to sort of test our methods, but also to see where our results sort of compare and contrast between these different cases to build a better knowledge about the sort of risk information and communication system for different types of storms. So I'll start with our analysis of Hurricane Harvey. And so again, as I sort of alluded to earlier, our overall goals for this analysis were really more of sort of an exploratory, qualitative, and sort of descriptive analysis, looking at questions about how professional sources are communicating with populations at risk, especially the ways that they're using visual forecast information to do that, how people are retransmitting and responding to these different types of information, and how these processes, again, are evolving as Harvey's threat evolved. And so in line with our methodological approach, we engaged in a multi-step filtering process. We started with a data set that was actually collected by some of our colleagues at the University of Colorado that had over 100,000 tweets in it, and it was collected sort of over the entirety of the 2017 hurricane season. And so we had to, again, engage in many steps to break this down into the sort of data sets that we thought would be most usable for our analyses. And so in order to do that, we filtered by time. We filtered to only include sources that were really local or sort of locally relevant to folks in the Houston and Texas areas. We only included tweets that had risk imagery and that were relevant to Hurricane Harvey. And finally, we filtered to only include tweets that included forecast information, again, given our focus on this sort of forecast and warning phase. And so that led to a data set of a little over 3,400 tweets. And so I should mention that this is a significant reduction from where we started, certainly, but it is still a pretty robust data set for the analysis that we were interested in. And so then, again, in line with our methodological approach, we were really interested in the imagery that was in these tweets. That was sort of the focus based on our research questions. And so we engaged in coding to try to categorize tweets based on the types of imagery that was present in their multimedia attachments. And so these are just a sampling of some of the image codes that we found in our data set. These include images that are developed by the Hurricane Center and by the Weather Service that really focus on the sort of the tropical threat, sort of the wind threat specifically, or the track of the storm, such as key messages, tropical outlook graphics, and the cone of uncertainty. We also included codes for things like model output, which often included spaghetti plots. And you'll note here that we made a distinction between tweets that were coded, that included sort of the names, logos of the Weather Service and NOAA versus those that did not, just to get an idea of whether branding was something that was important as part of this process. And so in addition to these image types that were more sort of focused on the storm's current location or its future location, we also noticed images in our data set that were focused on other hazards, such as the rainfall threat or the river flooding threat or convective threats. And then I should also note with our data set that while a lot of this was sort of top-down, taking image types that we knew that the Weather Service and the Hurricane Center were producing, it was also bottom-up in some senses in cases where we noticed that there were a lot of tweets that just included textual information as an image attachment, and so we decided to code for those separately. And then finally, the last thing we looked at here was watch warning content. And specifically, we also looked at these Weather Service impact watch warnings, and we separated these out specifically just because they have a very big impact on our data set. And so jumping right into that and looking at sort of the patterns of dissemination by imagery, you can see that these impact watch warnings are disseminated far more than any of the other image types in our data set. The second most is watch warning content. And so again, these watch warnings play really an outsized role in terms of what is in our data sets, what is in these Twitter data sets, and how these authoritative sources are sort of choosing to communicate during these events. Behind watch warnings, we see that cone graphics are relatively highly disseminated, and we see that there are dissemination of rainfall outlooks and forecasts and river flood forecasts sort of in line with the heavy rain and flooding threats posed by Harvey, but we don't see as many of these compared to, again, those sort of cone and watch warning image types. When we look at who is tweeting these types of information, again, we see that these impact tweets are really exerting an outsized influence on our data set, especially posted by the national and local Weather Service offices. And so removing those tweets from our analysis for this graphic, we see still that the local Weather Service and National Weather Service are among the most prolific disseminators of Harvey-related forecast information. We also see that these weather bloggers, and these were just a few local accounts that maybe were associated with, they just sort of had their own personal blogs where they would talk about the weather. We see that these were fairly active disseminators as well. And we also see that weather media at both the national and local scale were fairly important. On the flip side, we see that local news media and local non-Weather Service government, which includes county officials, government officials at sort of the local level, sheriffs, emergency management offices, these sorts of accounts were not as important in disseminating this sort of information. And that sort of comes into play when we started to develop our Irma analysis, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So then this is another sort of way to look at our data at sort of an overview level, and there is a lot of data on here, so I'll try to go through it quickly. But essentially what this graph is showing is it plots a dot on this timeline for each tweet in our data set, where the size of the dot represents how many retweets or how retransmitted each tweet was. And then the color here represents whether these tweets were branded with Weather Service names and logos or whether they were non-Weather Service branded. And then you can look along the y-axis here and see how, for each different image type in our data set, how the sort of dissemination and retransmission of these sorts of different types of information were evolving as Harvey evolved. And so to try to make sense of this, I'm just going to kind of step through a couple of different time phases of Harvey and provide some general overview. So this first time phase begins on August 17th. And so this is when Harvey developed as a tropical cyclone in the Caribbean, but it quickly degenerated. It was no longer a tropical cyclone for much of this time period. And it runs up until August 23rd, which is when Harvey reemerged in the Gulf of Mexico and then became more of a threat to Texas. But during this period, again, there was very little threat to the US mainland. And we see this reflected in the relative lack of dissemination of any sort of content during this period. We do see a few cone graphics that are disseminated when Harvey was still active, but again, these are not retransmitted at a very high rate. Later on in this period, though, we do see some model output graphics. And so a lot of these includes those spaghetti plots that I mentioned earlier. And so this perhaps reflects the sort of increasing likelihood of potential impacts in Texas and shows that at least some authoritative sources were trying to present some sort of information about what Harvey's potential impacts could be. But again, these are not highly retransmitted during this period. We see that this really changes as we get into this period from August 23rd, when Harvey reemerged in the Gulf of Mexico and the Hurricane Center began to reissue advisories for it, up until August 26th, which is when Harvey made landfall in south central Texas. And so during this period, we see really an explosion in both the dissemination and the retransmission of tweets, of a lot of different types of tweets posted during this time period. We see this especially for cone graphics, which are posted very, very regularly, very consistently, and which there are some tweets that are very highly retransmitted during this period. We also see key message graphics, which are posted on a consistent schedule by the Hurricane Center, and which have broadly high retransmission overall, which sort of increases as we get closer to the landfall time. And we also see rainfall outlooks and forecasts, which are not posted at as high of a rate until we get to sort of August 24th through the 26th. But again, this reflects that at least there is some effort to try to communicate information about these other sorts of major hazards associated with Harvey beyond just the cone and the sort of track forecasts. And we also see towards the tail end of this period, we begin to see a lot of watch warning information that is being disseminated during this period. And that sort of leads us into this final period, which really represents sort of the impact phase of Hurricane Harvey, beginning when it made landfall, through the time when it sort of caused devastating flooding impacts across portions of southeast Texas before finally departing. And so again, during this time period, I think the major story here is really this sort of glut of watch warning information that we see, both the watch warning and also these sort of impact watch warnings that are Weather Service branded. And so you can see here that these are very densely packed. There's a lot of these being posted, but they, again, are not broadly retransmitted at a very high rate. And so this suggests that there may be something about these tweets that is leading to lower retransmission, or that perhaps these sorts of watch warnings, a lot of which focused on the tornado threat associated with Harvey, were maybe not aligned with sort of what the salient threats were at the time. And we see this with convective outlooks and forecasts as well, which again, posted consistently, not highly retransmitted. On the flip side, we do see that rainfall outlooks and forecasts generally are highly disseminated, especially in the few days when the heavy rainfall and flooding threat was really acute in the Houston area. And a little later on, we also see river flood forecasts, which are, again, disseminated and retransmitted at a little bit higher of rate. So this does suggest that this sort of hazard-specific information can be retransmitted, but probably when it aligns most with the salient hazards at the time. So that sort of provides a general overview of what is in our data set. And so in line with sort of our more exploratory approach, we also wanted to dig into a little bit more depth on a few specific time periods that sort of represent different stages of Harvey's threat. And so we chose these 3 time periods where it's sort of the same 3-hour bin on each of these days. And each of these days represents, again, different evolutions in where Harvey was in terms of what the dissemination and retransmission patterns were on that day, what the hazard posed by the storm was on those days. And so just kind of going through these again, this is sort of the same plot that I showed before with sort of the retweet bubbles for each of the tweets, except here the tweets are color-coded so that tweets that are posted by sources that are local to the areas affected are shaded in green, and tweets that are posted by sources that are more regional or national are shaded in orange. And so what we see during this initial period on August 23rd, again, this is when the Hurricane Center began to reissue advisories on Hurricane Harvey, is that we see right around the time when these advisories are coming out at 10 a.m. local time, that we see a lot of authoritative sources sort of jump on this moment to post this new updated cone information, which shows Harvey making landfall in portions of Texas. A little while later, we see watch warning information in association with new tropical storm and hurricane warnings and watches that were issued for parts of the Texas coast. And so another thing that we notice with this data when we look at patterns of retransmission is that tweets that are posted broadly by these national sources generally tend to have more retransmission than other tweets posted by local sources, even when they're posted around the same time and include the same types of content. And so again, this is not surprising. These national sources probably have much broader reach, but again, it is something that we do see in our data set. There are some exceptions, though. We can see that this is a tweet from a local broadcast meteorologist in the Houston area, which garners high levels of engagement and retransmission. And that may be in part because it's posted right around or before 10 a.m. when this information is released. And so when these sources are able to sort of align with when people are really looking for information, that is an opportunity for them to see that information have maybe a broader reach. When we look on August 24th, so this is a day later, by this point, Harvey is well on its way to rapid intensification, and the new update from the Hurricane Center showed that Harvey was going to make landfall now as a major hurricane. And so similarly, we see these cone graphics that are posted, again, right around that time of the release of information from the Hurricane Center, and we especially see a couple of tweets from these national sources that garner very, very high retransmission. So again, this sort of information about Harvey's strength is really driving a lot of the conversation on Twitter. We do see other types of information during this period, such as these rainfall outlooks and flooding impact statements. But again, these are less common and are generally not as retransmitted as a lot of this information about the cone. Finally, we move to August 27th. And so at this point, we are deep in sort of the peak impacts from Harvey's flooding. And here we see a very different story. You see that 10 a.m. line here, and you don't see as many cone graphics that are posted. And so that information from the Hurricane Center is no longer really driving a lot of the conversation from these professional sources on Twitter. Rather, what we see is that it is these watches and warnings that are issued, especially when they are for parts of the Houston area, that are driving a lot of this conversation. We see that they lead to a lot of tweet activity from these authoritative sources. And again, especially this is the case when these watches and warnings intersect with major population centers such as Houston. Another interesting thing to note during this period is that it is no longer these National Weather Service sources that are driving a lot of the conversation. Instead, it is the local Weather Service offices that are providing information that is leading to these sort of dissemination peaks. And we see that the National Hurricane Center and other national centers are playing more of a supporting role. So here's an example where the National Hurricane Center is essentially taking the information that the Weather Service Office has issued and already tweeted out and sort of repackaging it and sort of providing support. And so we do see this interesting flip in sort of responsibilities between national and local level Weather Service entities. So in summary, I know that was a lot with our Harvey analysis. I think interesting things that we learned were that we do find that these professional sources generally are using imagery to emphasize the salient hazards as the threat evolves, but there are a few exceptions. We see that these cone graphics, for instance, are posted at all times during the event, even at times when maybe the track is not particularly salient. And we also see, again, this watch warning imagery, which is really very salient, which is really very highly disseminated during the impact phase, even though many of these watch warning images maybe do not provide information about the flooding threat. We also see that information releases from the Weather Service and from NOAA drive conversation and public attention, and that can funnel down to higher reach and retransmission for tweets posted by many other sorts of professional sources. And we, again, note that sort of flip between the National Weather Service and the local Weather Service in terms of who is leading that conversation. But we still have things that we wanted to know coming out of this analysis. We could see that tweet retransmission appeared to be impacted by a wide range of factors, such as who is providing the tweet, when a tweet is posted, which areas are affected in the tweets that they're sort of posting, and sort of the quality of the content as well, and many other factors that we couldn't quite see in this analysis. And so the goal with our Irma analysis, which is what I'll talk about next, was to try to use more quantitative methods to explore which of these factors is most important, and especially interesting for a case like Hurricane Irma, which is more of a sort of a long-fuse tropical cyclone event. And so before I get into the Hurricane Irma analysis, I just wanted to stop here and see if anybody had any questions at this point. And I'm going to, go ahead. Well, I guess he's got the mic.
So in this overview graphic with all the bubbles, the biggest bubble, which I guess relates to retweets, was a text. Do you have any idea what that was? Because it seemed like text is usually not very engaging, but then the biggest bubble, it seemed like it was actually a text.
Yeah, I think what we saw with those text images is that they were often screenshots of like watch warning information. And so especially you could kind of see in that last time frame, there was a lot of interest and engagement with information about like flash flood emergencies that were occurring in Houston. So I think it might have been one of those examples, because yeah, again, it is interesting that information.
I
that's-
would have guessed it's one of those. Sometimes they put out information like "you will die if you stay."
Right.
One of those. Kind
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's definitely something about the language that's included in those text graphics that's having an impact on people's perceptions too.
When you mentioned watch and warning on some of the previous slides, sometimes it was listed with EXP. I was wondering what EXP was.
Yeah, that was just a holdover from what we used to call it before. But those were just those impact watch warnings from the Weather Service. So yeah, that's the same thing. I just didn't change the label.
Did you see any of the forecast information as it's disseminated throughout all these networks? Was it getting modified in any kind of way? Like, for example, the cone of uncertainty graphic, was it being modified by broadcast meteorologists or anything?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think a lot of broadcast meteorologists will have the data provided to them by the Hurricane Center, and then they can ingest that into their sort of systems. And so obviously like the color schemes and some of the other sort of stylistic elements were different. In terms of the actual information, I wouldn't say so. I think it was, again, they're mostly relying on that sort of shared data layer. But I did see, there were some examples of like cone images that were cropped in a certain way where you couldn't really tell what the thing was, and we saw that those did not get as much retransmission. And so I think that there's a balance in terms of whether you want to modify those images or not. But yeah, again, it wasn't widespread that we saw that.
Anyone else? And move on to Irma.
Okay, great. So yeah, now we'll move on to our Hurricane Irma analysis, which again, the goal of this was really to build on what we learned during Hurricane Harvey and try to sort of expand on it a little bit. And so, an example of our research question here was, again, looking at this sort of visual risk information that professional sources of information were disseminating, and understanding what types of information, again, was being disseminated during this forecast and warning phase. And we really wanted to, again, think about the evolution piece of this and sort of more rigorously characterize the different subphases of this forecast and warning phase, using information about Irma's hazard, using information about the hazard, and how that led to changes in dissemination and retransmission, as we saw on Twitter. And again, really interested in sort of building on some of the initial results and initial things that we saw seemed to influence retransmission, and building more rigorous quantitative methodologies to try to, again, more quantify which factors were most important for influencing retransmission of information about Irma on Twitter. And so again, with Irma, we engaged in a data collection and filtering scheme here. For Irma, we actually collected our own data. And so this actually allowed us to be a lot more selective about which tweets we started with. We knew from the Harvey analysis that there were certain types of sources, such as those local government accounts and local news media accounts, that were not maybe providing as much storm-relevant information, and so we chose not to include them in this analysis. And we really chose, again, just to focus on weather service offices and weather media accounts at the local level, and then a few at the national level, just to see if we could see those sort of stratifications between different levels of accounts. And so we started with about 15,000 tweets, and again, we removed tweets that were not relevant to Irma. Another aspect of our methodology that I wanted to talk a little bit about here was the identification of automated tweets. And so this was something that we kind of noticed while we were going through the Harvey analysis, but in the Irma analysis, it was pretty undeniable that there were a lot of tweets in our data set that presented basically identical information, using the exact same tweet text, using very, very similar visual formats. And so we were able to look at different metadata fields in our Twitter data set and see that there was something kind of weird going on with these, where they appeared to be posted by sort of third-party bots or scripts that were being used to post things in response to different releases of information. And so we just wanted to categorize these as part of our data set because we thought that they were sort of interesting, and we had noticed from the Harvey data set that they had some impacts on the retransmission of information as well. And so we sort of separated those out and kept them in our data set. And then for our image-coded data set, that was sort of our data set for our regression analyses. Again, it only includes tweets that include a media attachment, and removed a few other types of tweets from some other coding schemes, just to, again, really focus in on the forecast and warning phase type of information. Again, with Irma, we developed an image coding scheme to be able to categorize the types of imagery. And so these were all ones that were shared between the Harvey analysis and our Irma analysis. But we did also have a number of images that were in our Irma data that we didn't see as much of in the Harvey data, and so we decided to categorize those as well. And so these include graphics that might include sort of observational advisory information about the storm and sort of its current location and attributes. It includes data from the Hurricane Center, such as arrival and probability of storm force winds graphics, which we were able to see more of just given the sort of longer nature of Irma's threat. And also spaghetti plots. We did see those in Harvey, but we decided to lump them in with model plots or model output. Here we decided to separate them out because, again, we saw a lot more of them. And then we also saw a number of different sort of hazard-specific plots or impact plots, such as storm surge inundation and hurricane threats and impacts graphics. And then because we included observational as well as forecast information for our Irma analysis, we also saw satellite imagery and radar imagery as some of the forms of imagery that were included in this analysis. So again, one of the big goals of this analysis was to really categorize these different sub-phases of the forecast and warning phase and to think about how dissemination and retransmission was evolving across them and to kind of think about how this compares with what we saw during the Hurricane Harvey analysis. And so I'm just going to sort of step through at a high level each of these phases. And so for Irma, again, we start with this, what we call the hypothetical threat subphase. And so this begins when Irma develops as a tropical storm. And again, this is sort of a time period, as we saw with Harvey, where there was not a lot of attention to this storm because it was way out in the Atlantic. It was not a direct threat to the US mainland. And so overall dissemination and retransmission of information during this period was relatively low. This all changes on the morning of September 5th, when Irma strengthened to a Category 5 storm, and Florida was shown in the 5-day cone for the first time. Again, sort of shades of what we saw during the Harvey analysis. And so we see a big spike in overall dissemination during this time period, and also a big spike in retransmission during this period, especially in this time period right after the release of this information, again, that showed parts of Florida in the 5-day track forecast cone. Our next phase is the looming threat subphase, and so this sort of encompasses the 48 hours before impacts when tropical storm watches were first issued for the Florida Peninsula. And so again, this is sort of the time period when a lot of people were making decisions about what to do, when it was becoming more and more clear that there were going to be major impacts from Irma. And so accordingly, we continue to see relatively high retransmission and dissemination of information during this period. And finally, we move into the impact subphase, which begins when Irma's first rain bands begin to wash ashore and carries through the worst of Irma's impacts in parts of Florida. And so, like we saw in Harvey, we see a lot of dissemination of information during this period, the highest of any period. And we also see that these automated tweets play a really key role in driving a lot of this information during this period. We see curiously that overall retransmission actually drops during this impact subphase, but again, a lot of that is driven by the fairly low retransmission of these automated tweets. If we look at non-automated tweets, we see that they have very high retransmission during this impact phase, especially again around the time when Irma was making landfall. So again, we can categorize these subphases by the types of image and hazard content that we see during each of these subphases. And so when we look at that hypothetical threat subphase, when Irma was not really a direct threat to the US mainland, we see that it's mostly tropical cyclone hazard content, and we see this reflected in the image content as well, a lot of cones, advisories, and satellite information to provide information about where Irma is and where it is going. When we move into this more actualized threat subphase, again, mostly focused on the tropical cyclone hazard, but we do see a growing share of other hazard information. And so again, a lot of cone and advisory information, but we also see spaghetti plots, which become more common during this period. And we also see, again, this sort of text imagery. And so during this period, we noticed that a lot of these text images would include bullet points like this, many of which would implicitly or explicitly sort of mention the uncertainty in the forecast. And so again, this is a period of time when I think people were beginning to pay attention to the potential threat, but there was still quite high uncertainty in what its specific impacts would be. And we see that reflected in the sorts of content produced by these sources. When we move into the looming threat subphase, here's where we begin to see a lot more sort of varied sets of hazards being communicated about. We see sort of this complementary sorts of visuals that are more hazard specific, such as threat and impact graphics. We do still see a lot of cone and advisory during this period, and a lot of watch warning graphics as well, as those begin to be issued for portions of Florida. But we do again see sort of this more trend towards more hazard specific information as it becomes available from the Hurricane Center and Weather Service. And finally, in the impact subphase, we see a real shift here again, like we did during Hurricane Harvey, where a lot of the information here is focused on the convective threat, and especially watches and warnings, which often include radar information, and which are often, in this case, often automatically tweeted by these sort of bots or scripts. And so this offers a way for these sources to sort of get this information out there and manage sort of the constantly evolving nature of the threat during this time period, but it does lead to sort of a lot of this type of information on Twitter. And so finally, I wanted to finish with some of our regression results, looking at the effect of these different sort of variables, and especially the effect of image type on retransmission, which is operationalized here by retweet counts. And so we use a negative binomial regression with random effects for each source in our data account, knowing that those had a very big effect in our Harvey analysis. And we use fixed effects for all other predictors. And again, we're really interested in taking these sort of contextual variables about when a tweet is posted or what other sorts of metadata variables are included, and including image branding and type to predict what affects retweets. And so I'll just step through these results briefly by sort of these different clumps of categories. But the results here are presented as incident rate ratios. And so if it's below 1, that indicates that it received fewer retweets or retransmission compared to reference. If it's above 1, it received more retweets. And the ones that are statistically significant are highlighted in bold. And so unsurprisingly, we see that tweets posted during this time period when people were not paying attention to Irma did not get as many retweets. But a little bit more curiously, we do continue to see that there is a statistically significant impact of this impact phase where tweets posted during this time frame are not as retransmitted. And so again, we're not entirely sure why that may be the case, but it could be possible that sort of the bulk of information leads to sort of algorithmic interference with those sort of watch warning images, or just makes it harder to find information during this period. Or it could also be that certain populations may be sort of tuning out as they realize that it may not affect them. When we look at time of day, again, our results are fairly intuitive. Tweets posted in the dead of the night do not get as many retweets as tweets posted during other times of the day. When we look at media type, we see that tweets that do not include text do not get as many retweets, and so including those sort of media representations is a good way to increase retransmission. And this is especially the case for GIFs, which garner almost twice as many retweets compared to reference. And so this is a really powerful way to perhaps visualize different types of information. And then finally, I mentioned those automated tweets, and we find here that this is one of the strongest effects in our model, where these have a very significantly negative effect on retransmission. And so again, it's maybe unclear why this is the case, if there's something about the algorithm that is not showing these tweets to people, if there's something about the fact that they're often used to visualize information that's really locally specific, that doesn't have sort of wider appeal. But in any case, we do see that these automated tweets are not as highly retransmitted. Again, with Irma, we looked at image branding. Here we see again that there's not a really strong effect for image branding, and so this does not seem to be something that really influences retransmission in a major way. And finally, we come to our results on image type. And so again, most of the images in our data set do not have a huge impact on retransmission one way or the other, but there are some exceptions here. And in specific, we see that cone graphics, spaghetti plots, and satellite imagery are really positive predictors of retransmission compared to other sort of reference groups. And so again, this suggests that this information about the storm and about its current location and about its future track, these are really valuable pieces of information that people are willing to pass on and share. On the flip side, we see that information that includes watch warning imagery is not retransmitted at the same level. And so again, we've sort of talked about some of the factors that may be at play here, but again, it suggests that there is perhaps some need to rethink how this sort of watch warning information is being communicated on Twitter during these sorts of events. So I'm going to return to where I started with those three sort of key areas of research with sort of theoretical and practical implications, and sort of tie the results from both the Harvey and the Irma analysis back. And so again, coming back to this idea of how risk information and communication evolves across weather disasters, we see from both Harvey and Irma that there really is substantial variation in the dissemination and retransmission across the forecast and warning phase. And we hope that the subphases that we've identified as part of our Irma analysis really help to further contextualize this, especially for predictable disasters like tropical cyclones. We also see that specific releases of information, especially information from the Weather Service or the Hurricane Center, can trigger these changes in dissemination and retransmission. And so this is important for, This is important for these professional sources to sort of monitor, because if they monitor these updates, they may be able to anticipate when people are going to be paying more attention to aspects of the storm. When we think about risk visualizations, we see that cones in both Harvey and Irma are highly disseminated and retransmitted. And this is sort of in spite of an accumulation of evidence that these are maybe not the best visualizations as a summary graphic for tropical cyclones, given they are often misinterpreted. And so this suggests that there is a need to really sort of reconcile how we maybe redesign or replace the cone with the fact that it is a very popular summary graphic and is something that people are really trying to put out, that professional sources are putting out on Twitter and that people are responding positively to. With watch warning imagery, again, we see sort of the opposite problem. It's highly disseminated by these professional sources, but it is not highly retransmitted. And so again, this sort of raises this question about the value of retransmission. In general, I think we want most tweets to be seen by as many people as possible. But for some sorts of warning tweets that may be geared towards, again, very local audiences, it may be hard for those to be naturally retweeted a lot. And so it's sort of an interesting question to think through: when is retransmission important and when maybe is it not, and how that dictates what the communication strategies are for these professional sources on social media. And finally, these results highlight a few visual information needs, such as visual depictions of uncertainty, like spaghetti plots. Currently, spaghetti plots are often generated by weather experts, but not officially affiliated with the Weather Service or the Hurricane Center. And so we see a lot of these come out, and they have very different sort of visual color schemes. And so it would be, we would recommend that the Weather Service sort of look into this as something that they could sort of operationalize as one of their products, so we have a more consistent message going forward with this information that people are clearly interested in. And then finally, there's really also, we see with both storms, not a lot of information about non-wind hazards at longer lead times. And so this, again, suggests the needs for more investment in improvements in being able to predict these specific hazards at longer lead times, as well as different ways to communicate that information as well. Finally, we come back to social media data analysis. And what do these results tell us about how to do this? We show that being careful and deliberate about how to collect, filter, and curate data can yield more focused data sets, which can yield more contextualized analysis. And our methodology is flexible, responsive, and tested. Sorry. However, as recent news has shown, social media data is ephemeral. And so recent changes to algorithms and ownership threaten the ability to use social media as a research tool, but also threaten the ability to use it as a way to conduct disaster response and recovery efforts. And so it really does show the need for other methodologies to get at this very perishable real-time data using the longitudinal surveys that Julie, for instance, has been working on as a way to see this sort of information that we can really now only get on social media that is extremely valuable in informing how people are making decisions during these events. And so I just have a few acknowledgements. We do have 2 papers that will be coming out of these results, one for Harvey and one for Irma. And so I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, and especially Rebecca, who has been an excellent mentor for me in thinking through these results and in general. And then our other collaborators who have offered great research assistance. And so before I lose my voice, I'm going to end it here. Thank you. I'll take any questions.
Okay, questions, comments?
A very nice presentation, thanks. So my question kind of pertains to this last point about, with social media in such a state of disarray, or potential future disarray, what do we do? And it strikes me that there's still a lot of information about how people are moving. Cell phones, Google has all of this stuff. Presumably other vendors probably do. Is there any option for, I mean, you wouldn't get the verbal context, but at least in terms of movements of people and how that is time dependent, is that a possibility, or is there some other possibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, research and methods are flexible, and so they will adapt to whatever the landscape looks like in terms of what is going to be available. But to that point, yeah, I do think that there are, movement and cell phone tracking data sets that might be available out there, and I think we're looking at some ways we might integrate that with some of the longitudinal survey data, for instance, as a way to pair that and to understand how those sorts of things are matched together. So yeah, I do think that there will be options moving forward. And maybe there will be a Twitter alternative that comes around at some point that offers what it offers too. And that's always an option as well. But in the interim, yeah, it's a little bit of a bummer to see the state of social media and the prospects of it for research. But again, I do have full faith that we're going to find ways around it and find different ways to get at these sorts of measures that are really, really important.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. So I live in Florida, and I was wondering, I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but I moved to Florida 13 years ago, and over that 13-year period, I developed my data sources that I found to trust more. Like I discovered spaghetti models after the first few years. So I'm wondering if there's any kind of regional savvy that develops in terms of the data sources that are trusted or that people go look for. And I don't know if there's any kind of regional differences you can parse out in this work.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say for sure with this data set, but I certainly think, anecdotally, we've seen this in other research as well, that there is that sort of regional, people will learn from previous disasters and then, take that information and apply it in future ones. So, so yes, I do think that is something that's out there.
Do you have any voice left?
I could try.
Okay, well, so it seems like the cone is the big winner when it comes to it. And it seems it's a simple object, right? It just goes
I think so,
directly
yeah.
to the cerebral cortex. But is there any way to maybe conize the what do you call it, the specific information maps? Like tornado threats or something like that. Somehow
Yeah.
put a cone instead of this county by county coloring and.
Right.
That takes more mental work, it seems.
Yeah, I do think it's a difficult problem. I mean, I think when we get to why the cone is misinterpreted, it's often because I think it appeals directly to some sense of, in versus out, that people have a sense of if you're in the cone, you're at threat. If you're not, it's not. And so I do think it is a challenge, but and maybe I'm biased just because I'm working on this now, but I do think that those hurricane threats and impacts graphics do have some potential for providing that sort of more contextualized hazard-specific information, just because they are just general color-coded maps that I think people can get the gist of pretty quickly. So that would be my answer. But yeah, it's a difficult communication challenge just because of how complicated those different hazard spaces can be.
Okay, I think we're finished with the question period. Thanks again, Robert.
Thank you.
And please join us for cookies and coffee.